The most criticized decision Adolf Hitler ever made during World War II might actually have been his best one. In August 1941, with his generals begging him to drive on Moscow, Hitler pulled his panzers south toward Kiev instead. Historians have called it the blunder that lost Germany the war. His own generals called it madness. Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, tried to resign over it. 6 weeks later, those panzers closed the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. Over 665,000 Soviet soldiers walked into captivity. 5 entire armies ceased to exist. And the man who led the operation, Guderian, the same general who had argued against it, later called it his last great victory. So today we're looking at both sides of the most debated operational decision of the entire Eastern Front. What Guderian and Halder wanted, what Hitler wanted, why the argument got so ugly that senior officers offered their resignations, and why the popular narrative that Hitler threw away Moscow out of stupidity doesn't hold up nearly as well as people think. To understand the argument, you have to understand what the Eastern Front looked like by August 1941, because both sides had legitimate reasons for what they wanted. Operation Barbarossa had launched on June 22nd, with over 3 million men attacking across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. 3 army groups, north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south toward Ukraine. By late July, Army Group Center under Field Marshal von Bock had achieved staggering results. The encirclement at Bialystok-Minsk in late June had trapped over 320,000 Soviet troops. The Battle of Smolensk in July netted another 300,000. The road to Moscow was open, and the Soviet forces in front of it were shattered. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group had covered roughly 700 kilometers in 6 weeks. But those numbers hid a serious problem. After 2 months of continuous combat, Guderian's Panzer Group was down to about 494 operational tanks out of roughly 990 it had started with. That's 50% losses, and the remaining vehicles were burning through spare parts faster than they could be replaced. The infantry divisions were still hundreds of kilometers behind the panzers because they were marching on foot, and the gap between the spearheads and the men who were supposed to hold the ground they'd taken was growing every day. And then there was the problem nobody in the Moscow camp wanted to talk about. Army Group Center had a massive exposed southern flank. So here's what Guderian, Halder, and Bock were arguing. Moscow wasn't just a city. It was the hub of the entire Soviet rail network, and if the Germans took it, they would sever Soviet logistics at its most critical junction. The Soviets would also be forced to commit their strategic reserves to defend it, which would give the Wehrmacht the decisive battle of annihilation that Barbarossa was supposed to produce. Halder believed that Stalin would throw everything into defending Moscow, and that a German victory there would shatter what remained of Soviet military organization. Guderian agreed, and added his own argument about momentum. His panzers had been advancing for 2 months. The Soviet forces in front of him were broken. If he stopped now, the Soviets would have weeks to rebuild defensive lines, bring up fresh divisions from the interior, and dig in. Every day of delay worked against Germany, because the Soviets could mobilize manpower at a rate the Germans simply could not match. And there was the calendar. Russia's autumn rains, the Rasputitsa, would turn the roads to mud by mid-October. After that, nothing wheeled or tracked would move until the ground froze. If the panzers went south to Kiev first, the Moscow offensive wouldn't start until October at the earliest. That meant attacking Moscow at the absolute worst time of year, with exhausted troops, depleted tanks, and winter closing in. When Guderian, Hoth, and Bock met with Hitler at Borisov on August 4th, all 3 generals pushed for Moscow. Guderian reportedly pointed at the map and said Moscow was where the Red Army would stand and fight, and where it could be destroyed. It was the clearest argument for a knockout blow, and on paper, it made sense. But it had problems that the generals either didn't see or didn't want to see. Hitler's argument was less dramatic, but arguably more grounded in reality. Before we get into Hitler's side of the argument, I want to tell you about something I've actually been playing. This is Medal Hunter, and they are sponsoring this video. No auto-aim, no luck-based mechanics. You're behind a stationary weapon, a flak gun, an artillery piece, a sniper rifle, and you either time your shot right or you lose. It is a mobile military action and PvP shooter built around 3-wave duels. Each wave, you're on a real historical battlefield. Pearl Harbor, Warsaw, Vietnam, Afghanistan. 9 locations pulled from actual operations. You pick your shooting mode, equip a gunner card for bonus damage or speed, and then it comes down to precision. One clean, well-timed shot can decide the entire wave. You collect gunner cards, upgrade your weapons, climb through leagues and clubs. There's a Club Blitz event running right now, a 3-day team relay where your club pushes milestones together for leaderboard prizes. So if you're into skill-based shooters and you like the military history angle, honestly, give it a shot. Download Medal Hunter for free on iOS or Android. The link is the first thing in the description. And use my code FACTBITES to get a welcome bonus pack completely free. Medal Hunter isn't about who shoots first, it's about who aims better. Links below. So, the generals wanted Moscow. Guderian, Halder, Bock. They all agreed. Drive east, take the capital, end it. But Hitler was looking at the same map and seeing something completely different. And his argument was less dramatic, but arguably more grounded in reality. And he started with the flank. The Soviet Fifth Army under Major General Potapov was sitting in the Pripyat marshes, right between Army Group Center and Army Group South. That army had been fighting since day 1 of Barbarossa and had taken appalling losses. But it was not destroyed. It was still operational, still launching attacks, and it was threatening both the right flank of Army Group Center and the left flank of Army Group South. The marshes made it nearly impossible to get at with armor, and the Fifth Army had been causing enough trouble that Hitler specifically called for its destruction in Directive 33 on July 19th. Now imagine Guderian gets his wish, and Army Group Center drives east toward Moscow with its full strength. The southern flank is hanging open for over 250 kilometers. The Soviet Southwestern Front, which still had hundreds of thousands of troops, is sitting to the south with nothing between them and Army Group Center's supply lines. If the Soviets counterattacked into that gap, while the panzers were 400 kilometers away fighting for Moscow, the entire advance could be cut off. Hitler saw this. He called it an unacceptable risk. And when you actually look at what the Soviets did to expose German flanks later in the war, at Stalingrad, at Kursk, during Operation Bagration, it's hard to say he was wrong about the danger. But Hitler's argument went beyond the flank. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. The Donbass region produced over half of Soviet coal and a major share of its steel. Losing Ukraine would cripple Soviet industrial output and give Germany access to resources it desperately needed for a long war. Hitler had been saying since before Barbarossa that the economic objectives in the south mattered more than the symbolic value of Moscow. And here's the part that Guderian's memoirs conveniently glossed over. Halder and the general staff had been quietly steering the campaign toward Moscow for weeks, sometimes interpreting Hitler's orders more loosely than intended, sometimes feeding him intelligence reports that emphasized Soviet strength near Moscow while downplaying the threat in the south. When Hitler caught on, he was furious. He issued a memo on August 21st that Halder's adjutant described in his diary as a black day for the army. In that memo, Hitler stated that the army's proposals for continuing operations did not conform to his intentions. He ordered the flanks dealt with first, period. The generals saw this as interference. Hitler saw it as correcting officers who had been ignoring his strategy from the start. On August 23rd, Halder made his final play. He met with Bock and Guderian at Borisov, where all three agreed that Moscow had to be the priority. Then Halder flew with Guderian to Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. The idea was that Guderian, as one of Hitler's favorite commanders, might be the one person who could change his mind. During the meeting, with neither Halder nor Brauchitsch present, Hitler allowed Guderian to lay out the full case for Moscow. Guderian argued forcefully. When he finished, Hitler walked over to the map, put his hand on Ukraine, and delivered what amounted to a lecture on why the South had to come first. The economic resources, the flank threat, the need to destroy Soviet forces in Ukraine before they could threaten the advance on Moscow from behind. And here's where the story gets interesting. The other officers in the room nodded along with Hitler's points. Nobody backed Guderian. The decision had already been made, and Guderian realized it. Rather than fighting a losing battle, he changed tack. He asked Hitler for permission to take his entire panzer group south intact rather than having it split up. Hitler agreed. Halder was livid. He saw it as Guderian cutting a personal deal with Hitler instead of standing firm on principle. He had already offered his resignation to Brauchitsch days earlier. Brauchitsch refused, saying the resignations wouldn't be accepted and nothing would change. And so the Army General Staff, having lost the argument, began preparing for the operation they had fought against for weeks. But the irony is that Guderian, the man who argued loudest against going south, is the one who made the Kiev encirclement possible, and he later acknowledged it as one of the great operational achievements of the war. On August 25th, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group wheeled south from its positions near Smolensk and began driving toward the rear of the Soviet southwestern front. Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, part of Army Group South, would push north from bridgeheads across the Dnieper near Kremenchuk. The two panzer groups were over 300 kilometers apart. The plan was to link up east of Kiev and trap everything in between. The Soviets had been expecting a renewed push on Moscow. Stalin and Stavka had been pouring reinforcements into the Moscow axis for weeks. When Guderian suddenly turned south, it caught them completely off guard. Soviet intelligence initially misread the move as a flanking maneuver aimed at Bryansk, not Kiev. By the time they realized what was actually happening, it was too late to react. And here's one of the details that gets lost in the Moscow versus Kiev debate. Guderian's panzers did not drive south unopposed. The Soviet Bryansk front under General Yeremenko launched a series of attacks trying to cut Guderian off. They failed, but they inflicted significant casualties and slowed the advance. Guderian's panzer group, already at 50% strength, was fighting its way south through active resistance while trying to close a pocket 300 kilometers away. Meanwhile, Stalin was making the situation worse for his own forces. Multiple commanders on the southwestern front, including General Kaponos, requested permission to withdraw from the Kiev salient before the trap closed. Stalin refused. He was wrong on both counts. On September 16th, Guderian's panzers linked up with Kleist's forces at Lokhvitsa, about 200 kilometers east of Kiev. The pocket was roughly 250 kilometers wide and 150 kilometers deep. Trapped inside were approximately 450,000 to 680,000 Soviet troops from 5 armies, the 5th, 21st, 26th, 37th, and 38th, along with elements of the 40th. It was the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. Stalin finally authorized a withdrawal on September 17th, one day after the pocket closed. It was too late. Kiev itself fell on September 19th. Fighting inside the pocket continued for another week as Soviet units tried to break out, but without mobile forces, without a supreme commander on the ground, there was no organized escape. Colonel General Kaponos, the Southwestern Front commander, was killed trying to break through German lines on September 20th. His political commissar, Burmistenko, was killed with him. By September 26th, it was over. German figures claimed 665,000 prisoners, along with 884 tanks and over 3,700 guns captured or destroyed. Some historians put the prisoner figure closer to 450,000 to 500,000, but even the lower estimate makes it the single worst Soviet defeat of the entire war, surpassing even the Bialystok-Minsk pocket and the later disaster at Vyazma. 5 Soviet field armies, consisting of 43 divisions, effectively ceased to exist. The Southwestern Front was destroyed as a fighting force. German casualties for the entire operation came to roughly 128,000, including about 27,000 killed. That's not insignificant. But the exchange ratio was staggering, roughly 5-to-1 in killed and captured, with the Soviets losing an entire strategic front in the process. So here's the question that's been debated for over 80 years. Was the Kiev encirclement worth the delay it caused to the Moscow offensive? The Moscow camp has a clear argument. Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, didn't begin until October 2nd, 6 weeks later than it could have started if the panzers had gone east instead of south. Those 6 weeks ate into the remaining good weather. The Rasputitsa hit in mid-October, exactly as the generals had warned, and turned the roads to impassable mud. When the ground finally froze in November, and the advance resumed. Soviet reinforcements from Siberia had arrived. Temperatures were dropping below -30, and German troops were fighting in summer uniforms. Typhoons stalled on the outskirts of Moscow in early December, and the Soviet counteroffensive that followed pushed the Germans back over 100 kilometers in some sectors. If Guderian had gone east in late August, the argument goes, the panzers would have reached Moscow before the mud, before the freeze, and before the Siberian divisions arrived. Moscow falls, the rail network collapses, and the war takes a fundamentally different course. It's a clean argument. It's also built on assumptions that don't survive close inspection. First, Guderian's panzer group started Operation Typhoon with only about 283 operational tanks, roughly 26% of what it had on June 22nd. Those losses happened during the Kiev operation, yes, but they also happened during the fighting around Smolensk and Yelnya in July and August. The panzers were grinding down regardless of which direction they went. An August drive on Moscow would have been conducted by panzer groups that were already at half strength and operating at the end of supply lines that couldn't reliably deliver fuel and ammunition. Second, the flank problem was real. If those 5 Soviet armies in the Kiev salient hadn't been destroyed, they would have been sitting on Army Group Center's right flank during the Moscow advance. The Southwestern Front had roughly 627,000 troops at the start of the battle. Leaving that force intact while pushing 400 kilometers east toward Moscow was exactly the kind of exposed flank that had destroyed armies throughout military history. The Soviets would prove at Stalingrad, just over a year later, that they were perfectly capable of attacking into an exposed flank with devastating results. Third, and this is the point that gets overlooked most often, even if Germany had taken Moscow, there's no evidence the war would have ended. The Soviet government had contingency plans to relocate to Kuibyshev, roughly 850 kilometers east of Moscow. Soviet industry was already being evacuated beyond the Urals. And Stalin had shown at Leningrad and later at Stalingrad that he would fight for every city rather than negotiate. Taking Moscow might have been a symbolic and logistical blow, but it was not the knockout punch the generals assumed it would be. And here's something I noticed when I was going through the sources. Almost everything we know about the Moscow First argument comes from the general's own post-war memoirs, written by men who had every reason to blame Hitler for losing the war. More recent scholarship, especially David Stiles' work on the Smolensk battles, has shown that Army Group Center was in far worse shape by August than Guderian and Halder ever admitted. None of this means Hitler was right about everything. His insistence on holding Kiev as a prestige objective earlier in the campaign had caused problems of its own. His economic arguments sometimes outweighed military reality, and his tendency to overrule commanders in the field would get progressively worse as the war went on. But on this specific decision, in this specific moment, his reading of the operational situation was arguably better than his generals'. The flank threat was real. The logistics couldn't support a Moscow drive, and the Kiev encirclement destroyed forces that would have been a serious danger to any eastward advance. The generals wanted the dramatic knockout blow. Hitler wanted the methodical solution. And the methodical solution produced the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. Try Medal Hunter, link and code, first line in the description.